Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Gili Segal. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and I'm a clinical associate professor at the Department of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at NYU Langone Health. Today we're going to talk about parenting autistic teens and young adults, that is the older age individuals, and how to support their growth and their autonomy in the very challenging process of transitioning to adulthood. So thanks for joining us. This workshop is brought to you all by the New York State Regional Center for Autism Spectrum Disorder at the Child Study Center at Hassenfeld Children's Hospital at NYU Langone. And just wanting to make sure to set expectations that this presentation is informational and not a clinical advice. For clinical services, you're always welcome to reach out to our Child Study Center, and we'd be happy to provide with more kind of like individually tailored services. So please stay with us. If you stay till the end, we'll also have a survey, and we always appreciate hearing from people about your needs, about your questions, and also there will be an option for questions and answers. So feel free to use that option, and I'll make sure to leave some time for that. So let's dive into this really important topic that I know that is not always being covered. And also today, we're just going to have a certain amount of time. So I'll try, reviewing as best as I can at this very limited time, some strategies that we can do. So our overview for today, I'm going to speak very briefly about parenting and autism and the experience as we know based on parental interviews in the literature. And we're going to speak about this particular age range, unique topics and unique kind of like focuses that we know that should be in mind when parenting teens and young adults on the spectrum. We're going to review some general and more specific strategies about how to support your growing autistic individual and to hopefully encourage them for a smoother transition and for, helpful and as pleasant as a process of transitioning to adulthood. And I'm going to very, very quickly also mention some really helpful resources that are out there. I know that there is tons of data out there, but I will mention some of the most reliable and most helpful places that you would potentially want to start with. So I assume that most, if not all, participants in this call can tell us themselves about their own unique experiences, but just to kind of like hopefully all of us like align and be on the same page, right? There is a lot of literature actually growing, amount of publications in the past few years about what it's like for families of autistic and neurodiverse individuals, and what are some, of the most common themes and aspects of parenting for parents who have children throughout the lifespan, children with autism. So this is taken from one work that actually reviewed many different articles. That all of these articles, what they had in common was that they were very focused on parents' qualitative and thematic kind of like experience that is like not as we usually do with like psychological research, like data and numbers, but data was more about qualitative interviews about how it is, to parent a child on the spectrum, and kind of like try to look at a vast number of articles that were out there, and kind of like try to map the similarities between different parents, and we know that each family is very unique and, has their own kind of like aspects of life that it can be very, very different from each other, but also, trying to look at the similarities. So you can see here, taken from this work that's published, that was published in 2016, several different themes that were very, very similar between different families, different articles. Actually, each article contained, a certain number of families that participated. So a first kind of like cluster of experience was all about the parent and their own kind of like processing since receiving the diagnosis, and maybe having some difficulties with their, particular autistic child and the way that they saw and the difficulties. Also, the parents kind of like focus on their own career, leisure time, and health consequences, coping with autism in general, and in particular with their child. It was really, really interesting to see that many parents really stressed out, that it's all not doom and gloom, and there are tons of positives and tons of strength of like what it means to be a family, often autistic individuals, and a lot of hopes and beliefs for the future that really, are a huge source of comfort and like positive strength for all of us. There is this very common concern of parents about when we are no longer, right? What will it be like for our child, or again, our emerging young adult, and how can we set them up for having the best, most meaningful, most satisfying life in all aspects, in all domains. There are other themes that, again, I'm sure that we can like just have like a full 30 minutes webinar on, but I'll really just briefly mention. So the impact on the family, that is the immediate and the extended family, and all sorts of like issues of dynamics and relationship, and the way that it is being impacted by having an autistic individual or more than one autistic individual in the family. The social impact, a lot about isolation, and sometimes even kind of like partial voluntary self-isolation for parents in different periods of their life, and the public stigma, and also health and educational services and how parents feel with them, and some of the, really good sources of strength and support, but not always. Sometimes there's a lot of complexity. Just getting these services, making them accessible, not to mention, relationship with the different therapists and agents in your child's life, especially as they grow, as your child grows, and then all of these other agents could take a very meaningful role, and we'll talk about that in a few more slides. The impact on the family, and more generally speaking, the social impact, and oh, sorry, this is just a repetition of the bottom part of my slide. So you kind of like get the idea, just to see it a little bit from a closer perspective. And let's talk about what it means in this like kind of like context to parent teens and young adults on the spectrum. So there are several different like unique aspects. The first, I think, that really comes to mind is like, okay, a young adult, maybe we want to plan for some kind of a career, some kind of an employment, having a little bit more certainty, especially as they grow up, right? I don't know, if people here have already gone through this. I know that myself, like as a clinician, whenever I work with a family of a young teenager on the spectrum, already during like the maybe more advanced years of middle school, I would say, hey, maybe it's time for us to explore and to start planning some kind of a transition plan. I know that it looks like it's going to be in a long time from today, which is actually true, but also these processes, as I'm sure all of you know, take a lot of time. And sometimes the family can seek for initiating this process already in middle school. But very, very important for the parents to understand what this process should look like. Some schools are better at, supporting this transition plan. Others could, maybe get some better understanding by, the parent kind of advocating. And if your teen or young adult, can start advocating themselves, then even better. You can practice that with them. More on that in a minute. So this is about employment, right? So how will their career path look like, right? What kind of an employment can we plan for? And again, that it seems like almost, an imaginary script when a child is just turning 14 years old. But again, we would want to already start exploring the options and what, their interests are in order to maybe better tailor their high school plans, right? And maybe already explore options for summer experiences for them, or certain programs that could train them and, just help them in achieving whatever goal that we and them feel is most appropriate at this time. Education. So I'm talking about, of course, graduating high school, but also maybe planning for, post-high school education for those of them who are interested. First of all, we need to understand what their approach to college and post-secondary education programs is, and help them own this process gradually, with us supporting and scaffolding, just like, I'm sure all of the caregivers on the call have done throughout, but in a way that's more age appropriate and is more, tending towards the supported decision-making process, rather than the, parents who kind of advise, and tell you what it is that you're expected to do. Thinking about the services, there's a very common phrase of speech mentioning the services, the autism services cliff, right? That comes right after they graduate high school and kind of become formally young adults. And how sometimes school systems are great with supporting and providing all services or most services that an individual is in need of, but then they become, kind of independent, but are not really, prepared enough compared to their same age peers who just graduated from high school. And it's okay, now what, right? So we would want to consider any relevant services for our teen or young adult, ahead of time, so that we know to work towards that. And, whatever it is that is needed and throughout the state services, or throughout any type of other external agencies, we really want to explore that. And remember, knowledge is power. Parents can really help guide their teens and young adult, after you educate yourselves. Self-advocacy is a whole other aspect of maturing and growing up. It is the time during teenage years to start learning and practicing how to explain to others your set, of strengths and weaknesses, or strengths and challenges, if you'd like, and what it is that you need in order to succeed and to grow and to meet your potential. And, in early years, this is mostly the role of the parent, but we do want to prepare them for better independent life, with trying to state this on their own. Social skills, of course, throughout the lifespan, social skills look so different. So social skills for a young adult would look very different compared to social skills that are expected of a teen, not to mention that are expected of a, preschooler. So that's a whole other aspect of life that requires some thought and planning and practicing. And of course, the minute they mature and they show interest an attraction maybe to other people and are interested more or less, in dating and sexuality, then we also want to address this in a way that's, helpful and supportive and informational. But of course, it could sometimes be a very sensitive topic for an individual to explore with their parents. So maybe we would like to consider additional agents that could be involved. So all of these, so much, right? Let's talk about general coaching strategies that help caregivers when they want to teach, train, and coach a young adult on the spectrum. Okay. Honestly, I think these strategies will help any person who wants to learn a new skill, but it's kind of like a transition in the parental role. You're shifting more towards being the coaches of your child, if you'd like a consultant for your child, rather than the, parent who makes decision for them. So of course, each family and where they're at, but really try to be mindful of allowing them a gradual more and more gradual autonomy and decision making, with you hopefully along the process being able to fade out. So how do we do that? First, it's called the 4 Ps. First P is priming. Okay, priming is all about teaching. For example, if you want your young adult to start owning their own appointment scheduling, right? Could be appointment scheduling, but for another young adult, the next challenge is going to be doing their own laundry or making themselves a sandwich, okay? Each young adult and where they're at. So whatever the skill is, first you teach, okay? And autistic individuals learn the best with explicit teaching. That is, you give them very concrete instructions and then you practice with them. Honestly, I'm, a neurotypical person and I still learn this way, the best way, no matter how much you explain to me a certain skill about how to bake hamantaschen or cookies, I will not know it until I actually go and do it. And it's better for me to do it with someone else who's already an expert, at least once, twice, 3 times, and then have them fade out gradually. So the same with your autistic teens and young adults. So first, you teach and you practice with them, okay? Then when they're ready, when you're assessing, okay, they're ready to do it relatively independently, then you prompt them in the moment, okay? So if the skill that you taught them was making their own sandwich, and they're already in the habit based, over years and years of you being the person making their sandwiches, Mom, I'm so hungry. So then it's a perfect opportunity to prompt and to say, oh, great, how about we'll go, and you'll make your sandwich on your own. Then when they're responsive, when they're taking the challenge on, when they're open to trying, always focus on praising, just like all of us. When I baked my first batch of cookies, honestly, it was horrible, really, really horrible. But if I had, my husband saying, oh, this is horrible, I would have probably never gone back to the kitchen. He was actually kind enough to tell me, you know what, it needs more work, but I can totally see the potential, or something along the lines, right? So choose the language that works well for your young adult, for your teen, about what they did well. And it could be as simple as, you know what, this was a really good try. And I see that, out of the laundry pile, actually your colored t-shirt, are really, really clean. And I can smell the nice scent. And then you try to maybe add some feedback if it was, far from being perfect, which we expect, right? This is very understandable. And this is where we provide the corrective feedback, okay? Praise, you cannot praise enough, okay? Praise the try, praise the effort, praise, if it's a successful effort, then even more so, right? But praise, praise, praise. You cannot praise enough if you want to keep on this intrinsic motivation to try, even if it's not perfect, right? Some of our autistic individuals really have a hard time with not doing things the best way possible. but it comes with practice. So we want to praise them to maintain some kind of a positive, optimistic approach about their potential. But we also want to provide corrective feedback. We don't want this toxic positivity of like, oh, it's perfect. And then they go and make these cookies, bake these cookies for their friends, and their friends are like, it's so bad, right? So we want to provide them with something in between that's helpful feedback, but really respectful, and sensitive. So we can use the sandwich feedback sandwich, where we start with a praise, then we provide a feedback, then we end with another praise. So this will look like, oh, I love the way that you went ahead and, did your laundry on your own. I really appreciate it. How about next time you'll remember to use, this particular laundry soap and not the other one, because the other one, is best for, I don't know, white colored laundry, right? Light colored laundry. But thank you so much for doing that, right? So this is the feedback sandwich, and it's easier to hear the feedback when we're having it, covered in praise from both ends. Some ideas about how to approach all of these really important conversations that sometimes could be very hard to do with our teens and young adults about their growing autonomy and independence. So as a general, starting point, entry point, I would recommend on like just facilitate more general conversations about their unique profile, their strength, but also their challenges, right? And how do you do that? Try to ask as many questions as you can. These teens and young adults are already at the age where it's not always very helpful for us to give them all the answers. And not to mention, sometimes we get very strong pushbacks, right? That's very age appropriate. That's great. Ask questions. What do you think your, 3 best qualities are, right? If you could, what would you have changed in the way that you're learning, right? So all sorts of like open-ended questions. And for those of them who prefer to get the closed-ended questions, that's okay too. Give them choices, right? Listen. Many times as caregivers, especially very experienced caregivers, we, not ideal, but we have an agenda. So even if you have an agenda, that's perfectly fine. You are doing nothing wrong. You're caring parents, but really restrain yourselves from making a comment, specifically a critical comment, but any type of comment, before you really hear them out, and let them have time. Some autistic individuals really need this additional time to process. And so just listen. Remind yourselves during the conversation, I'm going to be awfully quiet, just going to ask questions and maybe make some observations about what I'm hearing, what I'm seeing. And focus really on what is there already. So if your young adult brings to the conversation something that they're happy about, stay with it. If they bring to the conversation something that they would have wanted to change, that's okay too. Do not, bring up more and more and more and more topics. I know that there's a lot to do and a lot to cover, but we need to take it small steps in order to not overwhelm themselves and not overwhelm ourselves. And this is just, to get an example of common strengths that we know from research that we see among individuals with ASD. But just as an example, because it could be that your particular young adult or teenager, they have maybe some of these or maybe completely different strengths, but just, as a way to kind of like start thinking about that. And some ideas about planning and practicing the self-advocacy could be a good way to start with, just learning together and exploring together their rights, their legal rights. And if planning for college or for a workplace, then brainstorm together what is a reasonable accommodation, because this is the legal terminology, and you can take a look more at this website about their legal right? And just encourage considering different perspectives, whatever the situation is. Here I was thinking about like the situation of a workplace. So, if they get a particular accommodation, how does this affect them? That's super important. But also, how does this affect their coworkers, their supervisors, and the workplace, so that we understand better, what is a reasonable accommodation that will help them and meet them where they're at, but also, will be considerate of other people around them in the workplace. And remember that this is still a workplace that needs, to work well and smooth. Explicit teaching, I already mentioned. In general, a suggestion that's very helpful, whatever it is that's a very complex task, like career choosing, right? This could be very overwhelming. Try to break it down to tasks, right? So with the career choosing one, maybe we'll start with just, talking about what I'm strong at, transportation, and maybe certain like values that I have, and maybe the type of loyal employee that I am. And then we can break it down to making a list of different options, exploring different opportunities. And at each time, you work with your young adult on one step. We're not choosing the career now, we're just building it up gradually. Identify what resources you have and set, as I said earlier, realistic expectations to set them up for success. Here are some resources, and feel free to take a look at the different links while I take a look at our questions and answers. Where unfortunately I'm going to have only time for one question and answer. And where is that? Let's see. Okay. Questions and answers. Why doesn't it open? Okay. So actually people speaking about organizational skills and how to support their teenagers and young adults as they grow up. I will go up to the previous slide. This breaking down complex tasks to several smaller, simple steps, like with the career choosing example that I gave, is really, really helpful for the ability to plan and to work systematically, that we know that sometimes could be very difficult to anyone, but specifically for autistic individuals who also have these executive function difficulties, and this whole like idea of growing up could be very, very overwhelming. Okay, feel free to send us more questions, and we will do our best to help and to respond. And also, this is the Regional Center for Autism Services email. Please complete the online evaluation. It will be emailed to you in the next few days. And this was all for today. On behalf of the NYU Child Study Center and Regional Center for Autism Spectrum Disorder, thank you so much for joining us today. You can find a full list of the Child Study Center upcoming webinars, as well as recordings of previous webinars at nyulangan.org CSC webinars. Thanks again and have a nice day. Bye-bye. Happy Passover if you celebrate.